Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you all. My name is Dan Churchwell, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Director of Programs and Education here at the Acton Institute. Today is going to be a wonderful lecture, and it's just a delight to be here. You know our format. Many of you have been here before. We have roughly 35-minute lecture and 25 minutes of Q&A, so be writing down those questions that you might have for our speaker. And we will be having 2 mics because we have a wonderful crowd on our live stream as well. Please wait for the mic so that everybody can hear your question. I will point out who has the next question, and then we'll take plenty of time for Q&A. But we're really delighted you're here. Some of you I know were at our Tuesday event as well, so it's just really fun to see all the great, wonderful programming we're doing here at Acton. My pleasure today is to introduce our speaker, Dr. Molly Worthen, who is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her research and teaching focuses on American religious and intellectual history, and focusing on global Christianity. Her most recent book, what she's here to talk about today, of which we have many copies at our bookstore, so please pick one up, is Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. She's written extensively about religion, politics, and higher education for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Slate, Christianity Today, and many other publications. She also has popular level courses. If any of you have ever participated in the Great Courses, she has a really wonderful Great Course series on the history of Christianity, as well as an Audible audio course about charismatic leaders following some of the work of her book here. But I just want to say, I used to use her book when I was a professor, her book called The Apostles of Reason, which was based on her dissertation at Yale, and it's a wonderful book. But just in the last 5 years, Dr. Worthen has also become a Christian. Even though she was a historian of the Christian intellectual history, she has become a faithful Christian as of 2022. So she has a very unique history. Ivy League pedigree, just premier research, wonderful journalism. So she writes for the practical audience, she writes for the research audience. But I had the pleasure this morning of picking her up from Ann Arbor. She was speaking at another event at the University of Michigan, and we just had a 2-hour conversation, and I can just tell you the well runs deep. So please give a warm Acton welcome to Dr. Molly Worthen.
Thanks so much, Dan, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I know it's the lunch hour in the middle of the week. You could be doing a million other things. I really appreciate you being here. My plan for the next half hour or so is to tell you about a way of thinking about charisma that has helped me pull together some patterns across American history and in our own time. And mainly, I want to suggest that to understand politics, we should keep theology front and center. We should not keep the history of Pentecostals speaking in tongues over here and the history of so-called secular political movements over there, because they're really one story. When I started this project almost 10 years ago, I confused charisma with charm. I thought I would be writing about a lot of really charming people with high emotional intelligence, really good at working a room. I also associated charisma with great public speaking. Now, charm, inspiring oratory, these things showed up here and there in the historical figures I ended up writing about, but really more in the breach than in the pattern of things. I realized that the key to charisma is the giveaway, really, is its deeply polarizing effect on people. Charismatic leaders have a lot of people who adore them and a lot of people who loathe them, and not a whole lot who are just kind of lukewarm. So let me give you the definition of charisma that I finally settled on. Charisma is a relationship between a leader and followers based on telling a story. A charismatic leader invites potential followers into a compelling narrative that does a better job of making sense of their lives than whatever story they were using before. But if you are outside of the story, it's totally baffling and maybe even revolting. I've noticed that when we're on the outside of a charismatic relationship, a lot of us, even totally secular people, resort to quasi-religious or hypnotism metaphors. We use words like hypnotize, magnetize. We talk about converting followers to a cause. And I think this is because charisma is a concept that we punt to when we cannot identify totally rational material explanations for the relationship between a leader and followers. There is something else going on, and we know it's real, but we don't really understand it. This is why the sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term charisma from the world of the New Testament, church history, a little bit more than 100 years ago. The ancient Greek term charis meant originally chosenness by the gods, chosenness that brings with it some kind of unbidden power for good or for evil. In the New Testament, Paul takes that and makes it charisma, which broadly means supernatural gifts from God. It has different valences in different contexts. So in Paul's letter to the Romans, he uses the word to mean the free gift of salvation to all Christians. In 1 Corinthians, he's using the term more narrowly to describe specific spiritual gifts, like healing, prophecy, tongues, this kind of thing. Weber is the one who deserves the credit for coining this term as we use it today in kind of any sphere outside of explicit church spheres, to describe a kind of political authority distinct from the authority of institutions or traditions or authority that would come with having a big military force behind you. He used it to describe authority that has to do with a leader convincing followers that he or she has accomplished some supernatural feat, has some kind of amazing superhuman power, a power that resides in a special way in the leader as a person. To me, the phenomenon that Weber and the secular observers after him have tried to name is not really all that far from the supernatural thing that Paul was talking about in the New Testament. I think in both the religious and the worldly secular sense, what charisma is really about is the human desire to touch otherworldly power, to find a place in a big transcendent narrative that lends meaning to our lives, that gives us a sense of control over chaos. And whether you find a charismatic leader compelling or revolting depends on whether he's offering you an attractive part in the story he's telling. I want to add a caveat here. When I refer to a leader's message as a story, I am not saying that it's necessarily fiction. Humans are storytelling creatures. This is just how we organize information about the world. The difference between a charismatic leader who is an agent of moral progress and one who is not, I think, has everything to do with whether they offer a story that is grounded in reality. They're kind of inviting followers into a new way of organizing what they know about the world and how they see themselves in it. And on the other hand, there certainly are charismatic leaders who it would be fair to describe as fabulists, who kind of pull back the veil on a pseudo-reality. But charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. And I think that's important to stress because it's often such a loaded term. I think this way of approaching charismatic leadership as a kind of transcendent storytelling might help with a problem that scholars and journalists who study religion have been dealing with for a few decades now. Every year seems to bring a new study that shows the rising number of the so-called nuns in the US, right? The people who don't affiliate with any religious group. I think that figure is now at about 28%, although it seems to have plateaued. It may actually be dropping among younger Americans. We know that the church attendance rates and membership rates are declining. I think it's a mistake to assume that the only place the religious impulse lands is in churches. I'm especially interested in the spiritual but not religious crowd, which accounts for about at least half of the people who say they have no religious affiliation. I think that humans are just, in a pretty fundamental way, religious creatures who will seek this kind of meaning-making, this kind of relationship with higher order of reality. So the question then, if you accept that as an assumption, which I do, is where should we look for that impulse? And I think one place it's interesting to look is in the relationships between certain leaders and followers. My book starts in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, covers about 4 centuries of history. I thought today I would tell you a little bit about the later part of the book that's more immediately connected to our current political moment. I want to look at a particular kind of charismatic appeal that seems to have real power now, especially in the United States, and think about what it has to do with our need for religious experience and authority. So let me start with the basic question of how Americans get their information and develop a narrative about what's happening in the world, because that's the broad context for any leader who is coming in with a news story to tell. We have tons of data saying Americans have very low trust in institutions, right? I won't bore you with the statistics. You probably have encountered them in various contexts. But across the board, from Congress to legacy news media, higher ed, even trust in the military is down, right? Why are those statistics important for the story of charisma? Because those polls tell us about one category of leader that definitely lacks charisma right now, and that's experts. Institutions tend to be full of experts, staffed by experts, in the business of training experts, premised on the idea that you need the approval of senior experts in your guild in order to deserve the confidence of the public on whatever issue. That whole idea is falling apart. I want to suggest that the era immediately preceding our own, so call it 1945 through the 1960s, set us up for this in some special ways. That was an era when respect for professional expertise, the charisma of experts, confidence in the story that experts tell about the world, when that reached a peak and then collapsed. Then in our own time, I think we've seen the rise of a different type of charismatic leader, a type I call the guru. Now, what's a guru? A guru urges you to put your trust in him or her as an individual. They might link themselves in a sort of ambivalent way to an institution or a tradition or scripture, but they position themselves as the best interpreter. Second, a guru presents a totalizing worldview. So if you accept the assumptions he or she is presenting, you have an answer for every big question about right and wrong and the ultimate goals of life. Third, that worldview is based on an alternative picture of reality, a new set of facts that are at odds with what outsiders see. And then last, gurus usually operate adjacent to electoral politics rather than right in it, although sometimes they do make the leap. Before I say more about the guru, I want to talk a little bit about this age of the expert. The 50s and the 60s were the heyday of the cultural authority of secular scientific expertise in North America. So just think of higher ed booming after World War II. Lots of federal investment in research. Later, the technocrats working for John F. Kennedy on economic policy, on the Vietnam War, pitching the new frontier to Americans, which was a story that said, essentially, invest in expert-led innovation, expert-designed foreign policy, and America will spread democracy and a higher standard of living, and we will get to the moon. I'll add that the 50s and the 60s were the last time when maybe you could say that traditional religious institutions and religious experts were in charge as well. And what I mean is that this was the last era when liberal Protestant mainline churches were really thriving by the numbers, by their sort of representation in the highest levels of institutional leadership. Those denominations peaked around 1965 and have really crashed since then. So, one representative example would be the Presbyterian Church in the USA, which had about 4.25 million members in 1965 and now has a little over 1 million. And this is, of course, over a time when the population of the US has increased by about 75%. Another trend I want to flag in the post-war era is the beginning of the charismatic renewal movement, which was an explosion of New Testament charisma, Holy Spirit charisma, in churches that had never known this power before, at least not in this miraculous, sensory way, right? Hands up in the air, people getting slain in the Spirit, having these supernatural encounters, speaking in tongues. These revivals spread around the world. You could argue we are still in this revival, or at least its aftershocks. In some ways, it's fair to suggest that charismatic renewal breathed a new vitality into some established churches. One of the early nodes of it was among middle class, upper middle class Episcopalians of all people in the Los Angeles area. The Catholic Church, initially, after some hesitation after 1967, embraced it, certainly as part of its posture toward growing Christianity outside the West. At the same time, though, I think you could argue that charismatic renewal chipped away at traditional Christian institutions, as revivals often do. And it emboldened over the long term independent, often non-denominational megachurch pastors, religious entrepreneurs, rather than the older groups and denominations. You probably also associate the 50s and the 60s with the rise of the counterculture, certainly a movement driven by skepticism of institutions. My point is that by the end of the 1960s, we have a complicated picture. The experts, the educated establishment church leaders, they still are somewhat comfortable in their cultural authority. But if you know where to look, you see that this is starting to erode. Let me give you a snapshot from the end of this period where that erosion gives way to full-on collapse. This was a moment in my research when I really saw the value of putting the narrative of mainstream political history alongside the history of the supernatural religious movements that scholars usually keep sort of cordoned off from the respectable stuff. So let's zoom in on one place in time, 1970, Southern California, specifically the campus of UCLA. Picture Angela Davis striding across campus. She's 26. She's a proud member of the Communist Party. She's just back from a stint in Germany doing graduate work in Marxist philosophy. She's decided to come back to the States to get involved with the Black Panthers. And UCLA has hired her to teach a few classes while she's finishing her dissertation. She likes to teach in a miniskirt. Her natural hairstyle frames her face in a perfect sphere. And she packs in the students. They love her. The end of class, they come down and sort of crowd the lectern, trying to work up the nerve to ask a question. Protesters hang around too. Middle-aged Czech refugees, members of the local chapter of Young Americans for Freedom. Ronald Reagan is governor at this time, so he is on the UC Board of Regents ex officio, and they are worried about her presence. They are trying to get her fired. There are death threats. She's got to get a bodyguard. Now, what's the story she's telling? From one angle, it's the Marxist arc of history, the coming class war. But Davis is also pitching legions of students on a story about institutions. And she is using academia's own platforms to declare the whole system illegitimate. Now, just a short walk away from the UCLA philosophy classrooms, you'd find a very different scene in an old frat house. The frat boys are gone. It's been taken over by a group called the Jesus Christ Light and Power Company, a Christian commune run by a former Campus Crusade worker named Hal Lindsey. He's usually in a tank top, jeans, leather boots. When reporters find him, he's usually talking to college kids in his Texas drawl about the rapture and the Antichrist. It's 1970, so he has just published his famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, which is all about the coming apocalypse. And this frat house is an outpost of the Jesus People movement, a mix of disillusioned hippies and middle-class kids fleeing their parents' churches. So in an important way, it's a movement that grew out of established institutions, but it loathes those institutions. Here's Hal Lindsey talking to a reporter. He says, "These kids hate impersonalness, bigness, irrelevance, materialism." And I've just given you a description of the average institutional church. Now, I'm not saying that the Jesus freaks and the student activists rallying for Angela Davis are one unified movement, but I am saying that the Jesus people seeking the Holy Spirit and the charismatic relationship that Davis had with her followers are on a continuum. They're shared responses to the same cultural situation. They reflect a common sense of being fed up with the cosmos. They've been shaped by institutions that have let them down. They're hungry for a new eschatology, a new promise of how all of this injustice is going to end. And there's a way in which it's these young people, shaped by working inside institutions but feeling betrayed by them, who help tear down the authority of universities and the authority of mainstream churches. It makes sense, I think, that the 60s and the 70s were also an age of new religious movements, ranging from the infamous and scary ones, like Jim Jones' People's Temple, to cases that were sometimes benign and sometimes cult-like, like the evangelical charismatic Children of Love, the Guru Maharaji's Divine Light Mission. Now, these movements varied tremendously in theology and practice, but they all orbited around a guru, a charismatic leader who could look at you and make you feel seen, like all of your hidden problems are now out in the open and they are acknowledged as real and serious. They fit into a bigger story that you can see, you can learn to see if you come along and learn how the world really works. Also, of course, let's remember the cliches of this era, right? The Vietnam War, Watergate. By the time we are in the 1970s, the decline of mainline church attendance is undeniable. Scholars like to zoom out and call the big picture here secularization. To me, secularization is not the decline of the religious impulse. It's eroding trust in institutions in general and the transfer of that religious impulse somewhere else. By the time we get to the 1980s, the guru is not just a leadership model that you see on the margins. The guru is a model of authority that takes off in the self-help industry. in leadership studies programs at business schools, where the trendy message is that your boss should be your coach, can help you become your most authentic self, help you see how your personal story aligns with the story of the company. There's also that interesting mixture of self-help and televangelism that you see in Oprah Winfrey. And I'd argue you see hints of it in a brash New York businessman who appeared on Oprah's show a couple of times and mused about running for president, Donald Trump. I think two things make charismatic leaders more compelling, maybe more dangerous, in our current era. In the past, institutions and traditions were stronger, and I think they provided some counterweight, some context, a kind of alternative source of identity through which people could evaluate the story a new leader is telling. Second, the cultural authority of organized religion has been on the retreat for at least 2 generations, and I think this has fed both a crisis of meaning and a tendency to transfer religious impulses into politics. It has also fed a crisis of confidence, maybe, among many lay people and leaders who have stuck with traditional churches. And when you're feeling worried about your control over the culture, I think you're going to be extra intrigued when leaders come along and promise you a new path to power and a new way of kind of understanding the story of what's happened to your culture and what to do about it. The history of charismatic leaders in this country, and I think their influence now, only becomes legible if we are willing to pose theological questions. What is the transcendent narrative this leader is offering? What does salvation look like? How has this leader turned the feeling of tribe into a more powerful feeling of holy remnant? The history also, I think, gives us an angle on some current developments in the religious landscape. And we're seeing Pentecostal and Holy Spirit-oriented Catholic and Anglican churches growing among young people across the West. This is not a story limited to the United States. I just wonder, what might we learn if we entertain the possibility that secular and religious people are not so different, and that the contact with supernatural power and divine order that these converts are seeking has at least maybe a family resemblance to the promise of transcendence and enlightenment that you find in some varieties of politics on both the left and the right. Max Weber is one of my heroes, and I think I'm following his example here when I suggest that even secular scholars and journalists need theology, not to assert dogmatic prescriptions, but just to pose the right questions. Thank you.
We now have time for questions. Please raise your hand and I will call on you and a mic will come to you. There's a lot there. Yes, sir, in the back here.
There's always has to be someone who's first. So I'm trying to follow your logic model on charisma, and I'm asking myself this question. So obviously, people in general, whether you're a Christian or unbeliever, you're looking for some eschatological meaning and purpose in life. So the question I'm asking is, how unique is the charisma experience to America? And from your research, how does that extrapolate to the global scene, like Europe or Asia? The context I'm asking is, there's a lot of unique features in America, starting with our Puritan movement, starting with the Enlightenment. We have this drawn toward independence, anti-institutionalism almost certainly emerged in the 60s and 70s, and religion. Then I look at the global scene and I see people like Winston Churchill or Gandhi stepping up in their respective countries and being very charismatic in their leadership, but they don't come from the culture that America has. So what I'm trying to ask is, how does the concept of transcendence move beyond America in our unique culture and experience to the global scene? And do you find that the theory that you propose on charisma holds up across world views, or is it unique to America alone?
This is a really important question. Thank you for asking it. I'm a historian, and historians are really focused on, is my mic on? Yeah. Are very focused on context and very cautious to extrapolate. I think there are interesting ways in which the paradigm I've developed can be in conversation with various international contexts. And I get into that in the edge, around the edges of my narrative, and I can say a little bit more about that in a moment. But in important ways, I'm telling a very American story, and in that it is a post-Protestant Reformation story. In many ways, it is about the long tail of the Protestant Reformation and the way in which to take a very sort of crude summary approach to complicated history, in the context of medieval Christendom, the Catholic Church had a complicated and largely effective system of managing the human hunger for direct contact with the divine. It had all sorts of doors and windows through which you could access the divine, and ways of dealing with renegade, anti-institutional figures, whether it's to get that lady mystic, a father confessor who can make sure she doesn't kind of go off into heresy before she publishes her visions, or let that guy just sort of have his own monastic order, or order of friars and preachers, various ways to sort of balance and manage this hunger. And I think that snaps apart in the Protestant Reformation. And of course, Martin Luther and that first generation of reformers they're not anti-institutional. I mean, this is the great difference between the magisterial reformers and the radical reformers. And Luther and Calvin are quite horrified by the lengths, the extremes to which their Anabaptist colleagues take some of this impulse to sort of tear down. But ultimately, there is this focus in the Reformation on your individual relationship with the divine. It's you standing justified or not before Christ, before God. And there's a way in which that sort of individualistic, anti-institutional impulse that is part of the Reformation takes on its most extreme form in the context of what becomes the United States. The disproportionate representation among the first waves of European-descended immigrants, of kind of free church dissenter Protestants, right? Far more than end up in Canada, which has the ballast of the sort of French Catholic civilization first, that is so important for understanding the differences. And then this, relatively speaking, this kind of religious free market that is created both by this kind of presence of dissenter Protestants, as well as the First Amendment, which is totally unique in the Western world, and in its decoupling of federal authority from religion, at least at the national level. And while it's still very much a Protestant-dominated country and milieu, there is a way in which the marketplace of religion in America welcomes, encourages spiritual entrepreneurs in a way that is, I think, really quite unusual, quite special, and is not replicated in any other culture. And sort of that married with what you rightly describe as a kind of long-standing, we'll say ambivalence, deep ambivalence toward institutions and certainly toward centralized power, which of course takes on its most striking expression in the Revolution, during which Americans lop off a significant part of their Anglo-American political heritage, lop off the Tory big government part. And that has consequences for views of centralized government, all the way down the line. And there's, of course, the prehistory in the Puritans, right? There is this sort of skepticism that long predates the Revolution. So yes, I mean, the answer to your question is that for these reasons, charismatic leaders, while there are in other cultures also sort of dance between charismatic disruptors and institutions. I mean, Max Weber was fascinated by the American context, but he was also writing about Austrian and German politics and kind of seeing some of these dynamics there. I think that dynamic has an extreme form in America, and charismatic leaders have historically, I think, been able to be more effective for these reasons in our culture. Because most of the time, charismatic authority is the tool of the weak. I mean, if you have the option, if you have a vision for your community, and you have the option of taking on a prominent institutional role, or amassing a military force, you're going to take one of those far more reliable paths to power. So to foment a charismatic movement is often what you do if you are, by virtue of your radical views, your class status, being a woman, or not a white person, or what have you, outside the sort of obvious vectors of power, especially in earlier American history. That's sort of the logical path. But it's certainly not a path that guarantees success. And maybe we can talk about how to measure success. I think that's a complicated question.
Thank you very much for this talk. I really appreciate the storytelling aspect of charisma. I think that's fantastic. I have a marketing background, so I just absolutely resonate with that. So I love the historical context you're providing and all that. My question is kind of, in some of these really significant national figures, political or not, right, when they tell that alternative story that resonates and gets a large following, when that story, when a leader like that decides to change, it's like significantly change the story. In your experience, do they often, because they're so successful, they keep most of their followers? It continues to go along there. I asked it in maybe the very current context of a Donald Trump telling a very America first, no wars kind of context, has radically changed that story in the last couple of weeks. Right? It's too early to tell whether that's going to change his political future or the future of his movement. So I'm asking, like, historically, do you see examples like that, or things that make you think it might go one way or the other?
That's really interesting. I do think that there's a narrative momentum that carries those followers who have really committed to the story offered by this leader, that carries them along and can carry them past many apparent contradictions. That said, I mean, in this particular case, I think there are, of course, a range of reasons why people support the current president, and I would not say that for all of them, charisma is really the way to understand it, right? So I think, for those who support a candidate for more straightforward reasons that are tethered to a specific policy goal, I think there probably is a greater tendency to question that support, when it meets specific contradictions. But I think, historically, I think there's reason to have a great deal of confidence in the human capacity to overlook and adjust a narrative to accommodate new information without really recognizing its significance. And sometimes this has to do with the gifts of the charismatic leader himself in kind of reweaving. So I'm thinking about the great Louisiana populist Huey Long, who I write about in the book, and his relationship with FDR. And initially that relationship is one of great support, and Long is kind of bringing his followers along with the goals of the New Deal. But over time, he, over really the course of a short period of not even years, we should talk in terms of months, he becomes very critical of FDR and the New Deal as falling far short of its adequate promises to impoverish people in America. And this is tied up with his own irritation that FDR does not kind of give him enough access to power, doesn't seem to recognize what Long views as his role in FDR's own political success. But to create, as he did, a quite powerful movement, populist movement that became a source of deep, electoral worry for FDR and his staff in 1934 until Long was unexpectedly assassinated in 1935. To create that at a time when FDR, and his policies had significant momentum and popularity, I think is a testament to the way a leader can bring people along and really urge them into kind of an about face in their assessment of the direction of the country and who they should trust and why. And that, I think that has everything to do with the leader's attention to framing and reframing, who are the heroes and who are the villains. I mean, that is such an appealing and powerful narrative. The other pattern, though, that I've seen is that those leaders who really have the longest term success, if we want to measure success in terms of instantiating a set of policy goals that last beyond the career of the individual, I saw that not in those charismatic leaders who leaned fully or at least very hard into the dominant charismatic hungers, the fears and desires of their moment, but rather in those figures who showed a certain agility and an ability to kind of tack one direction or another depending on what was necessary. And FDR here is a good case study. He began his presidential career really riding the wave of, I think, a kind of hunger for the imposition of rational order at a time when the economy was in chaos. And so, if you go back and listen to his early fireside chats, he's really summoning listeners to, the best, sort of most cool-headed, rational version of themselves. This is who you are as Americans. You are reasonable people who will come together, but also who will trust the experts. You will trust the technocrats to sort this out. That is very different from the FDR who appears in Madison Square Garden in early 1935, dealing with this attack from the populist. Well, left is sort of maybe not quite right, but the populist attack from Huey Long. His own speechwriters are standing backstage saying, "Who is this guy?" He now sounds like a populist demagogue. He's sort of channeling the same kind of anti-elite, anti-Wall Street fat cats anger that Huey Long had sort of made into his brand. So I think long term, more is required than a sort of, tacking this way and that to adjust the story for a particular policy goal, but rather a sort of a broader and more flexible understanding of what constituents are hungry for.
Thank you. This is very good. I like your the religion. We're all religious, whether we are spiritual or not. We drive towards things, and also the question on success. You have the dimension on religious and secular. You have the dimension left and right. I'm curious on a different dimension that isn't talked much, because we have a tendency, whether left or right, to centralize and bureaucratize, and I think that's a lot of what's being pushed back against. So do you have any thoughts on the dimension of centralization versus more local localism or more subsidiarity, and what the impact on that is. Does that make sense? Or
I think so. Yeah, this is
some channel that that natural going centralization is a bad thing, and we know if someone gets too much power, whether it's capitalist or socialist, it ends badly. So if someone channels that charisma with charisma, that's someone that I'd like to follow.
I have wondered if leaders operating on a local scale would have a harder time leading a lasting charismatic movement without the accountability of concrete results for their followers in a way that creates this kind of narrower range for editing the story, for gaps between the narrative and what people are actually experiencing, than leaders who manage to access a bigger stage. If you are operating in a movement that has a context across many different communities and begins to involve kind of layers of emissaries and people who are sort of responsible for different local pieces of it, I think you can get away with more, in a sense. You can shift blame and edit the story in a way that is easier if you're a president than if you're a mayor. Now, I was in this book sort of deliberately looking for cases that ended up with at least some kind of national valence. So, I didn't spend a lot of time kind of empirically tracing the arc of these movements. But I think, here's an interesting example of maybe what you're describing, that perhaps it takes us in a different direction. I got very interested in the story of the Black nationalist leader Marcus Garvey. And the speed with which he built what was at the time, in the late teens and early 20s, the largest mass movement of African-descended people worldwide in history up to that point. And at the apex of his career, early 1920s, Manhattan, he is holding these mass parades in which he really shows, I think, an instinct for the power of ritual and regalia, especially for these World War I Black veterans who had gotten used to a certain understanding of themselves as soldiers with dignity fighting for democracy, and then they come home and they see that segregation is still dominant, in their own country. And so Marcus Garvey, both in the sort of practice of this charismatic narrative, in the parades and the mass rallies, as well as the story he tells about, creating a kind of independent African-descended civilization, reclaiming the African continent, getting over what he sees as a kind of cultural amnesia and restoring to Black Americans and beyond a sense of themselves as God's true people. That has this incredible resonance. And it seems like a movement that has this great efflorescence and then collapses as soon as he really gets on the radar of federal authorities. He's charged with mail fraud. He ends up in prison. He is deported, ends up dying in 1940 in London. But if we zoom out, we find we have to start paying attention to the fate of all the Garveyite chapters, the chapters of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which persist long after his career is over and he is gone. And they persist throughout the South. They interact in really interesting ways with the sort of beginnings of organized Pentecostal Protestantism, especially in the Black community, and they show the way in which the locus of the charisma is the story. So the leader, Marcus Garvey, is incredibly important. You don't have the UNIA. You don't have the sort of second generation, in the Black nationalist leadership of the 1960s. Malcolm Little, who becomes Malcolm X, is the son of Garveyites. You don't get any of that without Marcus Garvey himself, but the persistence of the movement in this kind of off the radar way, I think, is a testament to the way the real power is in the story, and it can continue beyond, sometimes in spite of, the kind of flawed, autocratic, and ultimately kind of mortal individual leader.
Thank you. You made a really interesting comment at the end. Even secular journalists need theology, and then I think you stopped. I don't know if you consider yourself a journalist as well as a historian, but I'd be really interested in knowing your journey through your study and your faith journey, and the effect of the absence of theology among journalists, what you see in that.
I think mainstream secular journalistic coverage of religion in this country is much better now than it was 15 or 20 years ago. I think there is more attention and more nuanced attention to the history and theology that informs contemporary religious communities, and that's because a lot of the reporters, working at places like the New York Times, which maybe we think of as totally secular and oblivious to religion, and their religion reporters all come out of very serious religious backgrounds. In many cases, those people are themselves committed members of religious communities. So I do think there's a sort of out of date stereotype. That's I think kind of premised. It's partly premised on a misunderstanding of mainstream media outlets as much more centralized than they really are, and because they are so reliant on freelancers and sort of people who are based in local communities and not in New York. There's more sensitivity there. But I guess more broadly, I mean, that comment is motivated partly by reflection on my own mindset prior to becoming a Christian, and how often I found myself kind of trying to make sense of contemporary political dynamics, and my mind goes to the category of idolatry, right, as a sort of a way of understanding a certain kind of human proclivity toward disordered loves. And that was a frame I'm a little bit unusual in that I'm a professional student of religion for my whole adult life. I was convinced of the truth of original sin long before I was a theist. So partly, I guess I'm speaking to what I think is a phenomenon much broader than journalism, and that's a way in which secular liberal culture that sees itself as having kind of transcended pre-modern religious categories so frequently runs up against phenomena that cry out for religious description. I teach a class at UNC called Sin and Evil in Modern America, and one thing we do is kind of trace the persistent tendency we see in ourselves and in culture to use a word like evil, which is a theological word. I mean, it has no meaning really outside of theology, even among students who do not consider themselves part of any religious tradition. And then as an analytical tool, I think a theological lens and a set of theological vocabulary helps us understand the stakes, especially at a time when I do think politics has become this vessel for meaning making and the pursuit of a real sense of kind of cosmic significance in a way that has gotten rather out of whack because organized religion is so anemic in our culture.
We have time for one more, and this gentleman down front here on the end.
How is it dangerous, if at all, for an American pastor to be charismatic?
Wow. Charisma becomes dangerous when it enables a leader to exempt himself from the checks and balances that an institution has created to moderate the consequences of the fall, essentially. And so, I think you'd be hard pressed to. There is no sort of religious institution that doesn't have some kind of problem, managing bad human behavior, right? But I do think that the particular problem of the unaccountable, charismatic leader, and unaccountability, lack of accountability, can have many causes. But where it is due to a sort of overgrown charismatic authority, I think we see that far more frequently in the Protestant world, and especially among evangelical Protestants, in no small part because it's a Christian culture that has historically a weak ecclesiology. And this has, in American history, it has been both the source of incredible dynamism and creativity and growth in evangelicalism. It's part of why evangelical Christianity is so varied and relative to many other religious traditions, quite sort of spiritually vital in this country. But it does mean that one of the persistent kind of syndromes or problems is charismatic leadership that becomes totally untethered from any kind of semblance of rule of law or checks and balances. So I think that my sense is every Christian tradition and community, it has certain things that it is quite good at, certain ways of navigating some of the paradoxes of Christianity that it is gifted at, and then it has other areas that are blind spots and perennial sources of dysfunction. And that would be true, I think, in the kind of management of charisma in the case of evangelicalism.
Please give a warm thank you to Dr. Worthen.